All right, what we're going to go over, just a big overview of the webinar today, is why it's important to plan ahead, some guiding principles to think about, things that we want to do before the gathering, during the gathering, and after the gathering. And I just wanted to make a note that this webinar is aimed at parents and family members. I know there are probably also some mental health folks and educators on the call as well. If you're working with youth who haven't shared their gender with their family, then some of this might not apply, but I still think there's a lot of really helpful principles in here that you can talk through with a youth directly to help them prepare themselves. So just keep that in mind as we go through it. Okay, so the holidays can be an emotional time. Of course, there's so much potential for joy and gatherings of families and being with loved ones and people that we don't see for the whole year. But it also can be, be a time of stress, both good and bad stress. The holidays are also a very gendered time. A lot of holiday traditions and family traditions, such as who cuts the turkey, who sets the table, who watches sports, those kinds of things tend to be very gendered in many families, and they're things that we don't even think about. So we're going to talk about that a little bit. The holidays are a social time. There are oftentimes we're seeing family that we may only see once or twice a year. We might see friends that we don't see or haven't seen in years. And so, if there have been changes in our kids' gender, it's a time where we have a lot of social interaction that we need to navigate. And as I said before, it can be a vulnerable time. It can be an amazing time of affirmation, but it can also be a time of rejection for yourself or your child. So we really want to, do what we can ahead of time to just set it up for success. So some of the things that we hear from youth about the holidays is how it's really hard for them to go to the holidays and look different than they have in the past and have to answer a lot of questions, especially if people didn't know anything about their gender beforehand. Sometimes it's hard for them because they feel like if they have shared about their gender, they only get questions about their gender and not questions about any other aspect of their life. And we hear, oh, I'm more than my gender. I want to talk about, my school and my friends and activities and everything else that I do in my life as well. Sometimes it's hard for them because they want to wear clothes. There's pressure to wear certain clothes during the holidays. Either they're kind of told they have to wear certain clothes, or it might just be that they want to wear some clothes, but then are worried about all the questions that they're going to have to answer if they do choose to wear the clothes that they want, and they don't want to bring attention to themselves. And then obviously there's like the even sometimes really intrusive questions, sometimes misgendering, and lots of things that can even be more serious for a child's mental health. So we're going to go through some guiding principles about kind of dealing with the holidays in general, and then we will get into some specifics of things we can do to actually prepare. All right, so the guiding principles we're going to go through are seeking gender congruence, learning from the past, being specific about your child's needs, communicating with others, meeting people where they are, and prioritizing your child's needs. Okay, so first, seeking gender congruence. So congruence means finding harmony or feeling a way of feeling most like yourself in your gender. And so there's a lot more to be said about congruence. If you kind of want to learn more about our framework of gender and what is congruence, we do have other resources for that. We're not going to go entirely into that whole structure here because we don't have time today, but I would highly encourage you to read our Understanding Gender page on our website, which really outlines our dimensions of gender and what seeking congruence is. But for our purposes today, It's really helping our kid find how they feel most like themselves and how they feel comfortable and in harmony with their gender. And that's the goal of that's the first thing we kind of need to define when getting ready for the holidays. And, seeking gender congruence can be impacted by so many factors during the holidays. As we said, clothing, names, pronouns, gifts, lots of different things come up during the holidays. So the first thing we want to do is we need to gather information from your child. And what we're trying to find out from them is, what does gender congruence look and feel like for you right now? As we know, that changes over time, but so this is something we probably would check in each year because it might be different every year. So really, we're just trying to figure it out for right now. And we want to know what needs to happen for you to feel good during the holidays. So, of course, that makes it sound so easy, right? Gathering information from your child. Well, any of us, either both with very little ones who can't articulate their needs or with teenagers who don't want to talk to you, we know that it can be much more complicated than that. So as we gather information, we want to think about things like, when is my kid most open to talking in general about topics? Is it in the car? A lot of people have successful conversations in the car. For my kid, it's right before bed, when she's tired and feels most, just like lets down her guard a little bit and is wanting to talk. Of course, it's at 11 p.m. when I want to go to sleep, but at least, there's some talking that might go on. Also know that, it really might come in bits and pieces. It's not probably realistic to think that you're going to sit down and go through all of these questions with your kid and get answers. I mean, some kids might work that way, but many won't. So it might be you kind of doing a little detective work and, getting snippets of information here and there to put the big picture together. And again, like, even if it's hard to find the information, the fact that you're asking the questions, you're really communicating to your child. Even if they're not engaged in the conversation and don't want to talk to you about this stuff, you're communicating to them that you're really committed to them and that you're prioritizing their experience at the holidays and that you care. Another thing we want to think about when we're talking about like this gathering information from our child is, we don't want to make any assumptions. We don't want to assume that we know what support looks like to our child, because what feels like support to us or feels like we're giving support might not be perceived that way by our child. Kids have lots of different feelings, well, all during the year, but especially at the holidays. So they might be very nervous at the holidays. They might just not want to rock the boat. They might want to, it can be very complicated. So that's what, like, part of this, the plan that we have is to really the checking in piece, so that you're not making assumptions about what your child might want and need in different situations during the holidays. And then also, as we go through this, we don't want you to feel like, we don't want this to be something that scares your child or makes them more anxious about the holidays. We can do this in kind of a way that tries to keep it supportive and light, and still remind the kids how much fun there's to be had at the holidays. And for you as well, the purpose of this is to kind of help you feel prepared, but not to make you feel anxious about the holidays. Hopefully that if we think about some of this stuff ahead of time, we can actually relax and enjoy the actual gatherings a little bit more.
Something I just want to add quickly is, I think probably especially for smaller children, asking a general question about like what they want to do for the holidays or for the visit to grandma's house or whatever might be harder for them to answer than breaking it down into specifics. And so it might be helpful for you to do a little mental dress rehearsal of the different activities that happen and ask them more specific questions about, like, oh, when we sit down at dinner, if the cousins split into girls and boys table, like, or something, if there's something, it happens at your holiday gathering, ask more specific questions than a general question about the holidays in general.
Yeah, that's a good point, because their minds probably don't work that way,
right,
and thinking about the whole thing. Okay, So the next principle we wanted to talk about is learning from the past. We want to reflect on previous gatherings and help our kids and ourselves identify really specific instances that did or did not feel good for them. And we really want to be as specific as possible about the words and actions of others and the impact that they had on our kids. So things like what worked, what didn't. Maybe ask, what are three things that didn't go well that we could change this year? What about some things that did feel good for you? Were there some specific conversations or questions that were difficult for you or that you maybe particularly enjoyed? Or how did you find yourself reacting to these situations? So, really just kind of guiding our kids to help them think more specifically about how things went in the past and just use that information for our planning for this year. Next, we want to be specific about our child's needs. We want to think about very specific requests that we're going to make of others around the holidays. And so here are some common areas to think about in advance. Of course, it's going to be different for every family and every child, but here are just some things that tend to come up. Names and pronouns. What name does your child want to be using in front of different people in the family, and what pronouns? Clothing, shoes, hairstyle, accessories. Gifts are always a big thing for many of our kids. Questions that are okay for people to ask your child and your child wants to talk about, and questions that are not okay. We're going to think through some gender-based traditions in our families and how those affect our child and either include or exclude them in ways that may feel good or bad to them. Think about people making general comments about gender. How are we going to deal with that? And if things come up about gender in the news. So these are just a brainstorming of some ways that gender might come up or might lead to conversations that we want to think about ahead of time if we can with our kid. So next, we're going to talk about communicating with others, because this is really the crux of, I think, preparing for the holidays. Unless your child is maintaining total privacy about their gender, which some kids obviously do, this is probably going to be the most important step for us to think about ahead of time. So let's talk a little bit more about that. First, communication plans are not one size fits all. I think sometimes families ahead of time think, oh, okay, either we're going to tell everybody or we're going to tell nobody. We're going to be and we're going to tell everybody everything and all the details, or we're going to, or tell, or the other extreme where we say nothing to no one. And really, it's much more nuanced than that. And that's really okay. So there are going to be different individuals that have very different relationships with you and your child. So we want to have different communication plans for different people or different groups of people. So it's really likely that you or your child's going to want certain people that they feel closer to know some things about their gender, while there are other people that they don't want to share either parts of their gender or maybe anything at all about their gender. Okay, so that's the first idea, is just to keep in mind it's not all or nothing. We're really going to break it down into smaller pieces for different people and the roles that they play in our life. And the second thing is we want to be careful about starting with ultimatums. Instead, we really want to try to create space for questions from those with whom we're communicating about our kids' gender. We want to help them understand that they don't have to agree or be comfortable, even with our child's gender, for the holidays to be a positive experience for everyone. And we really want to invite them to listen and learn. I think that sometimes parents get into like the mama, papa bear, parent bear mode, right? And really, get ready for protecting their child. And that's so natural and normal, but we don't want to start at the place of assuming everything's going to be terrible and assuming that, we're going to cut someone off if they don't get it, are absolutely perfect in supporting our kid. Yes, of course, sadly, there are some situations in families where it does get to a point where you just can't have your kid around a certain family member or loved one because it's too hurtful. But that's the last resort. And there's so many places in between that we can find some way of relating and some common ground, where we can keep the relationship central and find a way uh, to really still be in relationship with people that we love, um, and help them learn along the way.
Can I add something here?
Yeah.
I just want to underscore this is part of why it's so important to communicate ahead of time, because surprising a family member, even an extended family member that you otherwise aren't going to see except for this holiday gathering, uh, instead of communicating with them ahead of time, increases the likelihood that they'll have all of those uncomfortable feelings or questions in front of the kid, rather than kind of having some time to think about it and ask questions of you ahead of time. Yeah.
Right, and helping your kids really think that through. Obviously, if your kids are really little, you're going to have to be guiding it more. If your kids are teenagers and they are saying, I don't want you to mention it to X, Y, and Z, you might have to coach them through a little bit. Okay, well, what if they know, they're going to
Sure.
notice that you
Yeah.
look different and they're going to notice that you're using a different name. But sometime, but right, I mean, what we want to avoid is, your child seeing a look on someone's face or hearing a comment from someone
Yeah.
that's never going to be erased from their mind,
Yeah.
right? So the more we can do up front to kind of prepare our child and prepare others to make it a successful interaction, that's the best thing for our child. Okay, so more about communicating with others. Uh, Again, we want to try to not place blame for past experiences. It's super hard to do that sometimes, especially, if we feel like someone's really been hurtful to our child. But, we really want to try to, without placing blame, to be prepared to clearly describe what is and is not okay for your child, because that's the bottom line, the behaviors and the words that we need from other people towards our child during the holidays. Um, we want to be clear about what's off limits. If your child does not want to discuss their gender, people need to know that. If some kids are so different in that respect, right? Some kids love talking about gender and love talking about their own gender, and many kids don't, and
Mhm.
don't want to talk about their gender at all, and don't want questions, and just want to be themselves. So all of this is kind of dependent on who is your kid and what feels good to them. But we want to, once we know that, we want to make sure that others understand those boundaries as well. And and it might be up to us to really help other people realize that something that may seem like a really innocent comment or just a question, or mistakes that they make again and again, to them might feel like nothing, but to our kid can really have a lasting impact. And it can really kind of negatively and even sometimes permanently alter relationships, between that person and your child, and no one wants that. Okay, and then we also want to make sure that regardless of what other people are feeling, probably in most families, there are going to be some people who don't understand your kid's gender, some people who don't maybe even don't approve of it or don't support or think you're making a mistake as a parent. But regardless of what anyone else is feeling and their struggles are, we need to be really clear that they do not share their struggles with your child. Those are things, that's just one of the really clear boundaries. We don't want negative messages, negative questions, negative comments to our kid, no matter how old they are, and no matter how open they are to talking about their gender. Those kinds of negative feelings need to be discussed with other adults. Um, if you're open as the parent to having those discussions, fine. If you're not, you can set that boundary too. And you can say, here's a website, here's a book, send them to the Gender Spectrum website. There's lots of ways to learn about gender. And I hope you do take the time to learn about it, but you really can't share that with with my child.
Yeah.
So we have grandparents groups where grandparents can talk to each other. We have parents groups where parents can talk to each other and other adult family members. So there's resources out there for adults to deal with their own feelings, but it just can't be with the gender expansive child.
Yeah. And this could be a useful frame for, I know there was a question we got ahead of time about those with religious objections to, uh, encouraging a young person to transition. And I think that sharing this frame could help with that as well, saying even if you feel like this is wrong, even if you are yourself struggling to reconcile this with your own religious beliefs, please don't share that with my child.
Right. Right. And one resource that I wanted to mention here is we have a document on our website on the resources page for parenting and families called Communicating with Friends and Families. So it kind of goes over some concepts. It even has a couple of sample letters that might help you with some phrasing or some language you might want to use when talking to others. So definitely check that out. I think that's a really helpful resource as well. Okay, next we want to talk about meeting people where they are. Um, and again, this is kind of the concept I was talking about before, that people can show love for your child even if they don't understand or are not fully supportive of your child's gender. We, in our philosophy at Gender Spectrum, one of our values is that we try to meet people where they are. Many people come to their understanding of gender, their very limited understanding of gender, very honestly. That's all they've ever learned. That's all they've ever seen in their lives. And so, approaching it in an educational way, like, let me tell, actually, that's not, all there is to gender. Actually,
Or that's not everybody's experience.
or that's not everyone's experience about gender. And, actually, gender diversity is, existed throughout the world, throughout the entire world, throughout history. We're just starting to talk about it more now than we used to. So it's not something new. But again, once they know, then, they know.
They can't unknow.
They can't unknow it. And it's time, they can move forward. But remembering that maybe probably even at the beginning of many of our own journeys, right, we didn't necessarily know either unless it was our own personal experience in our life. So again, trying to meet people where they are and bring them along on the journey is really important for trying to maintain relationships where you can. Remind people that your child's gender is only one aspect of who they are. It's not all they are. It's not all any of us are, right? Your child has hobbies and interests and friends and school. And I think sometimes people get nervous about interacting with your kid, and just try to put them at ease and remind them that they're still the same kid with the same interests, and they can talk about those interests, and and still relate to them in this very similar ways that they did before.
I think it can be helpful to frame it as, nothing about this child has actually changed. Your understanding of who they are or what their gender is now more educated. Like, you're more informed about who they are, but they themselves haven't changed. They've always been who they are.
Right. And right, exactly. They might be expressing it a little bit differently. They might be showing it to the world in a different way, but that doesn't mean that they are a different person than they have always been. And sometimes I think, especially for people who are struggling with our kids' gender, help them with some language of how they can relate to your child. They can say things like, that must be really hard, or I really appreciate your sharing, or I can't imagine what that would feel like. Things that are not saying, I 100% support you in everything you're doing, and I agree with, whatever their beliefs might be, but there's certainly, again, there's so much middle ground, ways of showing empathy to someone you love and what they're going through without hurting them and insulting them. And sometimes people, I think, need to be reminded of that, right? That they can still relate and even show empathy to your child
without agreeing.
Without agreeing. Yeah. Okay, and then prioritizing your child's needs is also something that is super important. We don't want tradition to be a reason for dismissing your child's gender. Um, can new traditions be created in your house and in your family? Uh, Holiday customs that really force your child to compromise who they are, really have a cost for your child. And so we really need to re-examine those and change those where we can. And really, the bottom line is, and other people might feel uncomfortable. There might be an adult or someone who is uncomfortable around this whole issue of gender and your child's gender, but we always need to remember that another person's discomfort is not more important than your child's mental health and well-being. And I think that sometimes we as the parents are worry about the other adults, um, and forget that it's okay for an adult to be a little uncomfortable. And that's not where our focus needs to be. Our focus
Yeah.
needs to be on what our kid is needing in this situation. Okay, so yeah, so I'm going to go a little bit quickly through the rest of this because I want to make sure we have time for some questions and answers at the end. But here's kind of more specifically some stuff to do before the gathering. We want to really be specific about, okay, who's going to be there? What do they already know? What does our child want them to know? And how should the communication plan be for this particular person? So here's an example. Some people choose to make a chart, and this is, I think, just helpful for visual people. Like, so here's grandma. Grandma doesn't know. Do we want grandma to know? Yes or no? And what exactly do they need to know? And I think that's really important too. That's kind of the ask. It's like we want them to know about the gender, and then this is how we want them. We want them to use this name, this pronoun. Please don't make negative comments. And then who's going to talk to grandma? In this case, it just says dad will call grandma. And then below for an aunt, or for, so here's a good situation too, the neighbors, right? They don't know about the kid's gender. They don't need to know, right? They can just, it's, there's nothing, the kid doesn't know them or doesn't want them to know. And so the only communication that needs to happen is dad needs to tell grandma who's hosting the gathering not to mention anything to the Johnsons. So again, I think a chart like this um, can be really helpful. And sometimes you just have to be really clear with the person hosting, saying, I know you're inviting the Johnsons to Thanksgiving dinner next week. Please don't say anything about Maya's gender to them. We want them to know her as the girl that she is, and we hope that you can respect Maya's privacy. Just really straightforward and simple. Also, okay, here are some of the main things that come up before that we want to think about ahead of time. So clothing at, at holiday gatherings with pictures and going to church or synagogue or all sorts of different times when people dress up more, and formal clothes tend to be more gendered, unfortunately, for some of our kids. So think about ahead of time, how formal will it be? What outfits are going to be worn? Um, if there are certain ways that your child needs to dress, you know, can they wear, or they are not wanting to dress a certain way in front of their relatives? Are there things they can do to make them feel better, like wearing the underwear that they want, or wearing things under their clothes that make them feel most like themselves? And then, yeah, and then think about kind of people's reaction to your child's clothes, and how to deal with that up front too. I think one of the main things is not to make it a last minute thing. We don't want these conversations to happen as you're packing the night before the trip, because that can really blow up. We want to, talk it through, and really decide ahead of time, all of this, talk it through with our kid. What do we want to wear? What questions might you get? Um, and help figure out that if there are compromises they want to make or they don't want to make, and and what's and what they want to do, and so you're prepared too. Yeah. Okay. holiday traditions. We mentioned this a little bit before, but this is really something that can be super gendered in families without us really even realizing it, right? So we want to think about, here's just some of the things we want to think about for your own week, gathering. How are these things divided? Consider the roles that are associated with gender stereotypes in your family. So, and think about how your child can be included or excluded, and really think about all the kids. Like, what is the messages about these roles telling all the kids in your family about these gender roles and stereotypes? Again, like, being included in something can also be super affirming for your child, right? If there is something that's gendered that you can't get changed, like all the boys go out and play football, for your trans son to be included in that, can be super affirming to them. But thinking it through ahead of time can be really helpful. Presents. Many of our holiday gatherings, many families have presents involved, and this can be a real point, again, where you can be so affirming for our child, but it can also be really hurtful for our child. So we want to communicate with people ahead of time to give the presents that your child actually wants, and not to use gender to challenge my child's gender that you might not agree with or understand. And if this is difficult for you, give them options. They can do a gift certificate. And one great thing that people can do is offer an experience, like movie tickets. If someone likes sports, tickets to a sports thing, and an experience with you is even better, right? That's a way to connect with your kid.
I mean, this is another moment to remind people that the kid is the same kid that they've known, and they are still interested in art or whatever they were always interested in, and to not change their expectation of what they might want because their understanding of what the child's gender is has changed.
Right.
Stick to the kids' actual interests and not
Exactly.
gender expectations. Yeah.
Exactly. And I think, lots of families, some families, parents like share gift lists or give ideas to people if that's not right. It doesn't feel right in your family. Sometimes a parent can drop hints about what your child's really interested in, this year. Oh, my kid's really interested in dinosaurs this year, or really interested in, whatever it is. Just kind of more subtle hints about interests, so to kind of guide them in the right direction. Think about where you're going to stay for the holidays. Will your child be comfortable where you usually stay for the holidays? If it's someone that is really struggling with your child's gender and is going to continually misgender them and really upset your child, think about alternatives. If you can afford it, stay in a hotel or an Airbnb, or try to find a more affirming relative to stay with, or a friend. Again, be willing to be flexible in some of the traditions in order to protect your child a little bit and give them some space. Practicing before the gathering. Imagine scenarios, plan your responses, talk through with your kid different ways that your child can respond. With little kids, role playing can be really helpful, with questions that might come up, or what if your cousin asked you this? Let's come up with, what would you want to say, and let them practice with you. Some little kids don't want to be part of a role play ahead of time, but they'll want to watch, two adults do a role play, and might throw in a suggestion here and there. So a lot of families too establish some kinds of signals, because obviously for holidays, no matter how much you try to prepare, there's always going to be conversations and situations that come up that you just can't plan for, right? Sitting around, having a conversation. So some families find it really helpful to have a signal, something, or some kind of gesture or a signal where your kid is saying, yes, I want you to say something and intervene in this conversation, or no, I don't. Because it really, again, those are things that aren't all or nothing, right? It can depend who's in the room. It can depend on how vulnerable your child's feeling at that moment. There's lots of things. And we really want to do, again, what feels supportive to our child in that situation. So sometimes having a signal or some way to say, I need you here, say something or don't say something. I know you want to say something, Dad, but please don't, can be really helpful. And then I know there's families too who, even if if your child doesn't want you to say anything in a certain situation because that feels worse to them, it brings more attention. There are families who have little signals, right, to just say, I heard that, I'm with you.
Yeah.
Do you have a sample of that?
Yeah, I know a family who actually, this was a family with a very young child, about 4 or 5, who was really anxious about being misgendered by the grandparents, and they decided to make it into a little game so that ahead of time they decided anytime grandpa misgenders you, we're going to find each other across the room, make eye contact, and do a long distance high five. And it just became this silly thing. And it really helped the kid know, like, someone's on my side. And even though I don't feel like I can confront grandpa or correct grandpa, like, we acknowledge every time that that's just a silly thing to have happen, that grandpa keeps misgendering you.
Right, which I like that.
For that age, it was appropriate.
Right,
Yeah.
it's like, I see you, I know who you are, and I have your back. So think of, just creative ways, things that might work for your particular kid to help them feel supported in those moments. So during the gathering, we really want you to, even if things seem to be going great, check in, not constantly and to annoy your child, but, check in a couple times and make sure. Definitely have some way to take a break, kind of built into the weekend. Have a plan for going for a walk, um, uh, go hang out in the car and listen to music, go back to your hotel if you need to. But really, especially if it's a situation where your child isn't feeling full support, to have breaks planned are really important. And also have ways to seek support, like make sure your child, whatever is supportive to your kid, if they have a friend that they love talking to, make sure there's a time they can text or call each other. If there's an online community, make sure there's time that they have access to that if they really need to step away and seek some support. And then you might also consider ahead of time what, if anything, is going to be like, nope, we need to get out of here. Like, this is not, we need to leave completely. What is just going to be absolutely too much for my kid. Okay, and then after the gathering, we also want to check in with our kid. It doesn't have to be right away, but we also don't want it to go too long without talking about how things went. That's going to serve a couple of purposes. One, it lets your child know that their experience is your priority and that you're in this together. But it's also a really great way to identify specific difficult times or great times that to help you prepare for the next time. And sometimes, it might be you helping your child get a sense of perspective on, remember, you had a really great conversation with this cousin. Remember, wasn't that good? Or if someone who you expected to be difficult to deal with was really okay, so kind of talk about the good and the bad. And then also, if something particularly difficult did happen, we really want to take time to identify if there are any relationships that need to be repaired. And if so, how are we going to do that? Are we going to write something, talk to that person, send them some resources? Again, just talk through what we need to do to make any repairs if something did happen. Okay, so there are also lots of other holiday resources that Gender Spectrum has. We are doing a online discussion group for parents. It's going to be 4 calls, all on preparing for the holidays. So if there are things that we didn't touch on or we don't get to in the Q&A today, or if you just want some time to really talk through your own particular family situation and get input from other families on how they've done it and how you might handle things, please join those discussion groups. We also have online discussion groups before the holidays for teens and one for preteens. And next week we'll be coming out with a holiday email. Everybody who registered for this webinar will get it. That will have lots of other resources in there as well. There's a video for grandparents, a video for parents, lots of helpful information for holidays. So please keep an eye out for that. And to sign up for the groups, you just go to our website and we have a groups page. Okay, so, and then again, I'm just going to leave this slide up for 1 second. I, again, just want to make sure that you know about all of our different resources for all family members and professionals. We really want people to use them. We have our online pick groups. We have an online community called The Lounge, which has about 4,000 people in it. Our website has a wealth of information, 2 books, The Transgender Child and The Transgender Teen. We have a film called Creating Gender Inclusive Schools, and then we do intensive work with schools and other organizations. So any questions about anything, you can just write to info@genderspectrum.org. Okay, so now we are going to open it up. We want to do some Q&A, and we have some. I'm going to actually
please type in your questions into the chat function if you have questions you want us to address. And in the meantime, we'll share some of the questions that we got ahead of time from you who wrote that in with your registration, and speak to some of the questions we heard earlier.
Great. So one question that we touched on briefly was kind of how to deal with specifically when a very religious, a family member or a loved one has a religious objection. And this can come up during the holidays often, right? Because there's lots, oftentimes there's religious rituals and services. So I wanted to point out that we have a lot of resources about religion and gender on our website as well. We have, in fact, we have a page about holidays, and specifically from a religious perspective that would be really helpful. And we can actually send, that'll be included in the email that goes out next week. There's resources about, some of the passages that people tend to quote to you from the Bible called the clobber passages. There's different ways of dealing with it. And I think some of I don't know, JT, what do you think? I think some of the same principles that we talked about here are going to really apply in that situation as well, which is that you don't have to agree, you don't have to think it's right, but you need to be respectful and you need to not hurt my child.
Yeah, and if you think it would be compelling and helpful for the person that is having the religious objections, you can share with them how not being affirmed in their gender can really hurt and harm a child's mental health, that it's not just a preference or an acting out or whatever else they might think that doesn't have real consequences. And you can emphasize that, even if they never expect to agree or come around or understand, that it is not, it's not acceptable for them to translate that into something that's going to harm your child's mental health.
Right, and try to bring it back to the relationship. I mean, most of our loved ones love our kids, right? And they want a relationship with our kids, and they don't want to hurt our child. So I think what you were saying, JT, is right on, right? We might bring it back to, actually when you say these things, it's very hurtful.
And Pam, I've heard you say and remind people, most religions are really founded in a concept of love and of kindness, and try to tap into the values that are connected to their religion.
Exactly, the fundamental values. There's no religion that is not based on a fundamental value of love.
Yeah.
So I've definitely heard lots of families of faith, kind of talk about their own interpretation of their faith and try and reframe it for family members as much as they can. Another question that came up was was people who are traveling with their kids during the holidays and being navigating gender with going through security lines, and what is that going to be like? I think unfortunately, that probably has a lot to do with the actual individual that you come in front of.
Mhm.
That, TSA has done a lot of work around this, I know, but it just depends. They even have there is a blurb on their website about transgender folks traveling and a number you can call. But I think it really comes down to the kind of the person
Mhm.
and the group of people that you're come up against. And
Yeah.
I've heard families talk about really easy, amazing experiences and some that have been some difficult experiences. So I think one thing with kids is try to avoid the scanners if you can. Most people do,
Yeah.
especially with younger kids. They don't have them go through the scanners anyway. Um, if something comes up and there's some kind of more information needed, you can ask to go to a private space. There's lots of, almost every airport has a private space, so ask to go to that with your child. um, I think, and just kind of preparing your child to help them kind of tamp down any anxiety they might have about traveling, about what it's going to be like, and and how you're going to be there to help them through it. um, uh, that kind of thing. For older kids who or young adults who would go through scanners, you can kind of talk to them about, okay, would you rather go through the scanner and maybe have a question come up, or would you rather have a manual pat down? Some prefer one, some prefer the other. But again, just knowing ahead of time that these are kind of the options
Mhm.
can really be can be helpful.
Yeah. And I think for all kids, and this will be probably particularly relevant for the younger kids who might not understand how airport security works, just prepare them that unless you've done a legal name change and have a travel like air ticket in their new name, that they're going to have to give their birth name or their legal name when they're asked for their ticket, or that they're going to be called that. And just say like, it I know it really sucks, like they just don't know your new name, and we got these tickets before you changed your name, or like, what you say it in whatever way makes sense for the age of your child, but just acknowledge that that's going to happen and prepare them for it. And similarly to preparing for the holiday interactions, just kind of check in about what would feel supportive in that moment, and plan to kind of do anything that would be comforting to get through that moment. And but preparing them that it's going to happen is just helpful for them to know.
Yeah, for sure. Not like avoiding surprises
Yeah.
is always a good idea.
We have a new question that's come in. Is it okay to send two holiday letters, one with the old name and one with the new, since not everyone knows yet?
I guess I'm not 100% sure. Holiday letters meaning like you're like
I
your
think this
holiday
probably means like,
newsletter,
yeah, like a
your
newsletter or
yearly.
a holiday card, and not a letter to inform people is what I'm assuming this is, but
Huh.
like an actual, like, this is what happened with our family this year.
Yeah, I mean, I think decisions like that, um, it depends a little bit on. I would always start with what your child
Yeah.
wants. I would always start with, how does this feel to you? Is this what you want? And if they say no, that's uncomfortable, then don't do it.
Yeah.
If they say sure, that's fine, I have no problem with it, then can be a creative solution, right? I think you can figure out ways to put photos and not names. You can
Mhm.
put,
Mhm.
you can do all, or if there's a nickname, or if
Or
there's,
our eldest or our first
yeah,
grader, or
right. If there are ways, if your child's not comfortable with that, right, maybe try to think of ways to do a holiday letter without a name. um, yeah, I would start with your kid.
yeah. I mean, and another, right. And if your kid feels really strongly that that would feel unaffirming and hurtful to send something out using their old name and not acknowledge their gender, you might consider only sending letters that year to those that
Mm,
know, or that to those that you feel comfortable sharing this development and this news with.
right.
And maybe as you let others know, they can go back on your list for the next year, but maybe shorten your list and keep it, the family updates to those that you feel closer with and who are supportive.
Right. Right. Another group question we got ahead of time was about kind of applying this to very young kids.
Mhm.
Um, Do you see, JT, things that are different for very young kids in any of these
I mean, I think we've
preps?
hit on examples that you and adaptations you can use for young kids as we've gone.
We do have one resource that I think is always helpful for parents of young kids, which is on our website, called Talking with Young Children About Gender. And sometimes that might even be helpful to share with family members and friends because it really gives language
Yeah.
about appropriate ways to talk about gender with little ones. I think a lot of times family members, especially if they have their own kids,
Mhm.
are worried. They're less worried about dealing with your child, and they're
That's
sometimes get
exactly right. Yeah.
very anxious about having to explain it to their own kids,
Yeah.
and not want to say something wrong, and not just
Mhm.
not doing it wrong.
Yeah.
Uh,
So
so
yeah,
yeah,
I totally agree. It's helpful, and honestly, the way that it breaks it down and simplifies thinking about gender in ways that young children can understand can also be really helpful for old folks that don't understand. I don't even just mean old, but not children, not young children. It can be helpful for everybody to have it really simply broken down and talked about. Like, well, we thought you were a boy because of the anatomy you were born with, and we made our best guess, and we were wrong. And that language can actually help other people see it in a way that's like a little more inclusive too. I'll also say that you might if you look at that resource and find some language that resonates for you, but don't want to send a an attachment to folks ahead of time or feel like it's too formal or they wouldn't read it, you could incorporate some of that language into whatever way you communicate with them about your child in advance. So say, if you're thinking about how to talk to the cousins about this, here's some language for explaining it to children or whatever. Just you feel free to incorporate any part of that into your own communications to help.
just about out of time. We have 3 more minutes. If anybody has any last minute questions.
I think I just want to add one more thing in terms of the question of what might be different for very young kids. And I think I would just remind parents and caregivers that when you have a really young child, the concept of consent is a little bit different. You are having to make decisions that affect your kids that they aren't really in a position to think through the implications of. And so just think about like only communicating the bare minimum. These are the names and pronouns you should use to refer to my child, and not get into anything else, any other part of the child's journey of discovery, any anatomy stuff, like anything that's not
Yeah,
necessary. Like, you don't need to get into it. And just think, once you tell folks things, especially if they're not very close family members, if they're more peripheral or they're more distant friends, you can't unsay things later that children might, when they get older, might want to keep private. So just be mindful of what you communicate on behalf of your kids, who don't yet understand the implications.
absolutely. All right, and then just to kind of close out, I do want to bring it back to, all of this, is just a way to try to prepare. It doesn't mean that holidays are going to necessarily be really, really hard for your kid. They can be really wonderful for your kid, or they can have some wonderful stuff and some hard stuff for you and your kid. So we really wish you a wonderful and supportive holiday season. Please feel free to join our discussion group if you want to talk more, and keep an eye out for our resources.
Well, thanks, everybody.
Thank you.